So this episode begins immediately after Rose and does so effectively to continue the well-advertised adventure of a lifetime element that this new series was so confident in expressing. Like Rose, this episode, entitled The End of the World, was written by showrunner Russ T. Davies, directed by the magnificent Euros Lyn, and starring Christopher Eccleston as the Doctor, with Billie Piper as Rose. What is excellent about this episode from the word go are the small lines of dialogue that brilliantly explain and contextualise the setting and help the audience understand this future setting. This was especially important for those who might still be tuning in to Doctor Who for the very first time, as it perfectly explains some of the functionalities of the show in a very subtle but effective way. The premise of this episode is that the Ninth Doctor takes new companion Rose to the year 5 billion, where the sun is expanding over Earth, destroying it in its wake. We are on board the observation space station Platform 1, who are holding an exclusive event with the richest alien beings observing the Earth's destruction, but mysterious metal spiders gifted by the adherents of the repeated meme to the other guests are secretly infiltrating and sabotaging the station. The TARDIS lands within a section of the Platform 1 base. Rose steps out first, followed closely by the Doctor. They climb down the steps to the lower observation deck, where we get the remark from the Doctor that this is the day the sun expands. Welcome to the end of the world. Roll titles. After the title sequence, we move on to the actual observation deck, soon to be filled with guests, as Sir Stuart retorts. It is here where we get our first glimpse and the introduction of the psychic paper, when the Doctor says, "I'm the Doctor, this is Rose, she's my +1, is that alright?" This scene so excellently and accurately represents the Ninth Doctor, and indeed who he goes on to be throughout the duration of Series 1. It is a classic line that embodies the character so much, especially in retrospect of the series as a whole. This is then followed with said guests arriving, and is where we see the costume department coming out in full force, with an array of creatures and monsters entering the observation deck, ready for the end of the Earth, exchanging gifts in an effort to represent peace. Cassandra's gifts are certainly not peaceful, that much can be said. Of course, this is also where we see the face of Bo, and indeed Lady Cassandra, for the very first time, who will both respectively go on to make additional appearances after this. It is here where the plot of the episode really begins to develop, as Lady Cassandra enters the equation and begins to make her authority and presence known, introducing herself as the last human to the discomfort of Rose. We then see Cassandra and her moisturising surgeons enter, bringing with them the gift for the rest of the guests. The blue minions bring in the jukebox, referred to by Cassandra as the iPod. That everlasting Ninth Doctor dancing gif of him dancing to Britney Spears' Toxic and Soft Cell's Tainted Love, highlighting some classic Earth tunes, forever holds a special place in my heart, and is a scene I find myself rewatching quite often. Comedy done right. More on that later. We then move on to the scene where Rose and the Doctor return to the observation deck where the TARDIS landed. They discuss the aliens, and indeed, we as the audience get an explanation of how the TARDIS translation system works and operates, which causes Rose to react in arguably a selfish manner, remarking how she didn't consent for the TARDIS to do this. This is, however, where the discussion gets particularly heated, and is where we see how broken this Doctor really is. That he doesn't want to discuss his origins, his home planet, nor who he really is. The pain of the Time War is so clear. Much credit needs to go to Christopher Eccleston once again, who really makes you believe in his performance, and that this is really an incarnation of the Doctor like no other, broken, and not needing any unnecessary aggravation. This scene simply works so well as it invokes anger within the Doctor we've never seen before, and really amps up the audience into wanting an explanation into the mystery of why he's acting in such a way. I must say, this really helps the payoff at the end of the episode. A mention must go to the CGI of the episode, as although looking very dated now, certainly achieves what it needs to. It's easy to see why this is one of the more expensive episodes of Series 1, especially when you consider the visual and practical effects gone into it. And I do believe the effort and work gone in really does pay off. You don't include 203 visual effects shots for nothing, and you have to applaud the effort gone into making this episode one that's very special. One of the scenes that does let this episode down for me is when the sun filters descending on Rose, who, of course, nice bit of meta commentary by RTD, as the Doctor jests, is trapped in the observation deck where the TARDIS landed earlier in the episode. I feel this scene is rather weak, as many of Rose's lines seem very forced, and are not delivered particularly well, such as "Where am I going to go? Ipswich," whereas the story should really progress to where we see Cassandra is a real menace behind all of the deaths. It seems unnecessary as a scene, and seems to me as a way of getting Rose out of the way for a while so the plot can develop and we can focus much more on the Doctor. And it must be said, the whole idea of the other guests finding out things after they've been established to the audience gets rather tedious rather quickly, and is frankly a bit patronising to us, as we are well tuned to what is going on and we really don't need it spelt out further. Indeed, a further negative is with Rose again, as mentioned before, in the way that she can be really good in one scene, thinking about the scene with the blue woman in the corridor, but then switching to being painfully bad. This is then where we see Cassandra teleporting away, just after she disengages the force field, and leaves all the guests, including the Doctor and Rose, in immediate peril, where it must be noted that Zoe Wanamaker's voice work here works superbly and helps to create a real intense scene, and she plays really well off of Eccleston to really ramp up the intenseness and highlight the threat they are now succumbed to as a direct result of her menace. This is where we get one of the highlights of the episode for me, when the Ninth Doctor and Jabe share a conversation regarding the Doctor being a Time Lord and how it's remarkable you are even alive. It's here where we as viewers got our first real insight into the devastation that must have occurred during the Time War. We see the Doctor get particularly emotional, even shedding a tear at one point, as Jabe mentions her scanning him earlier in the episode and mentioning how she now knows where he is from. I love this scene as it epitomises who the Doctor is and so perfectly demonstrates how strong he is as a character, that he can demonstrate real emotion in a scene that really requires it most. Christopher Eccleston continues his astounding acting in this episode, and in this scene this is really represented and demonstrates how he is one of the best actors to have ever played the Doctor. His conviction of lines, facial expressions, body language, movement and more is magnificent. One segment that is especially excellent within this scene is the close-up shot, compliments to Euros Lyn for that remarkable bit of direction, that really makes the audience begin to believe that although this is still the Doctor, this is a Doctor that has done something disastrous, but is clearly in pain from the experience. This was arguably one of the most important scenes in all of New Who, as it stands out and is one of my all-time favourite Eccleston scenes. Another scene that particularly stands out for me is when Jabe dies as a direct result of the Doctor's actions, and we see the internal conflict of the Doctor, who is deciding whether or not he can continue, and if he can actually save everyone on Platform 1 or not. What directly follows is another of my favourite Ninth Doctor scenes, and is where we cut between Platform 1 colliding with the burning Earth, and then how the Doctor is trying to cultivate the mental capacity to move past the fan and lift the appropriate switch. This again is where we see an appearance of Nine's theme, which so appropriately scores over the scene, and perpetuates the Doctor's internal conflict, and then how he overcomes it. This is then when we move on to a rather dark scene where the Doctor reverts Cassandra's teleport after she had used it much earlier to escape Platform 1, after initiating her scheme, but is this time without her surgeons, and therefore leads to her not receiving the necessary moisturising she needs to sustain herself. This is where we see the PTSD post-war Ninth Doctor come into full force, letting her die, as he remarks, "Everything has its time and everything dies," even after a plea for pity from Cassandra and Rose asking the Doctor to help her. This indeed paves the way to a later scene which will explain it all. More on that scene later. Some interesting segments of this episode for me include how this is the first episode that introduced the Bad Wolf story arc, as it is mentioned for the first time when the Mox of Balhoun says, indubitably, this is the Bad Wolf scenario. This of course not meaning anything at the time, but can be seen as laying the foundations when looking back in retrospect of the series. Another clever thing that this episode does is balance comedy and seriousness perfectly. It tonally knows when to do one and when to do the other. For example, a comedic moment is where the Doctor says, "What are you going to do? Moisturise me," after being threatened by Cassandra's surgeons. This scene creates a truly comedic moment correctly and appropriately, something the Moffat era could have done so much better. I digress. Additionally, the episode does indeed know how and when to do the more serious scenes, such as when Jabe is killed, and how we see the effect that has on the Doctor, who has suffered enough pain and torment already. As this episode infers, his actions were committed fairly. Of course, after Day of the Doctor now explains, this is, canonically, the incarnation immediately after the War Doctor, and therefore is the incarnation that feels the effects the most. This then leads to the final scene where we rather poignantly return to modern day Earth, and what follows is the iconic scene where we as the viewers, adopting the perspective of Rose, receive a full-length explanation about the Time War, and how this is the post-war Doctor that has lost his people, and indeed Gallifrey. He is indeed still a Time Lord, but he is now the last of the Time Lords. The Time War, the war to end all wars, was fought and lost by the Time Lords. Brilliantly scored with 9's theme yet again, this scene begins with the Doctor saying how, "My planet's gone." I cannot talk about this scene and not admire Christopher Eccleston's performance again, as in this scene it is sublime, and really makes us as the audience empathise with him, but yet is mysterious enough as a scene overall at the end of the episode to leave the audience wanting more. Who was the war against? How did the war actually end? How was the Doctor the only survivor? What happened to the other Time Lords? Questions, all yet to be answered, but there to be discovered throughout the rest of Series 1 and onwards. So, overall, it's clear to say the Ninth Doctor is indeed firing on all cylinders, and partnering with new companion Rose is simply fantastic. While this episode isn't nearly as good as the previous story, I wouldn't say it disappoints, and it does indeed achieve many of its aims, and indeed has many great special effects and moments of sheer brilliance, setting up many of the themes and plot elements that would go on to become very important throughout the series. However, often the humour does seem to fall particularly flat, and the plot is indeed predictable at times, but I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. The good definitely outweighs the bad.